Halfland, an ahistorical prehistory. The Battle of Absley. In the year 99 of the Common Reckoning, Grimbold, the rebel warden of Overwater, and Orm, the lord of Dwarfbridge, determined to turn and fight the advancing army of Godric, king of the Skeldings. The place they chose to make this stand was the small village of Absley. The forces available to Grimbold and Orm were the battered survivors of the Battle of Rosebay Rise. Grimbold could muster some 75 spearmen, supported by a mixed force of approximately 100 unarmoured archers and javelineers. Orm led a force of about 100 armoured dwarves, half armed with crossbows, and the remainder bearing shield and spear. Godric's army was also that which had fought at Rosebay Rise, but his army had been victorious and were keen to finish off their foes. Godric had started the campaign with 150 of the king's spearmen. Death, injury and disease had reduced their numbers, but he still had 75 of these professional armoured fighting men, the core of his force. These were supported by Aldric and his 100 armoured cavalry, bearing sword, shield and javelins, and over 200 skirmishers. Absley sat astride the path to Overwater, in the midst of several patches of woodland, in an area of undulating countryside. Grimbold and Orm placed their light infantry and crossbow dwarves in the fields to the south of the village, the direction from which Godric was approaching. At the north end of the village, on either side of the street, concealed by the houses, they placed their spearmen and spear dwarves. Godric started the battle by sending 100 of his skirmishers forward on his left, seeking to engage Grimbold's light infantry, who were stationed on that side of the village. On the right, he ordered his remaining skirmishers to advance into a patch of trees, from where they could loose arrows at the crossbow dwarves. On the left, Godric's bow-armed skirmishers exchanged arrows with Grimbold's archers. This exchange caused no appreciable casualties on either side, but while Grimbold's archers were thus distracted, Godric's javelin-armed skirmishers were able to rush them. There was a sharp scuffle on the edge of the village, and Grimbold's archers withdrew. But Grimbold's javelineers charged into Godric's men, killing many of them and throwing them back from the village in some disarray. On his right, Godric's skirmishers had more success. A hail of arrows thinned the ranks of the dwarvish crossbows, who were unable to effectively target the Skeldings concealed in the trees. A final volley of Skelding arrows eliminated the crossbow dwarves as a fighting force, and the Skeldings emerged from the forest to advance unopposed towards Absley. Seeking similar success to that on his left flank, Godric unleashed Aldric and the cavalry. The horsemen charged forward, skirting the village to the left. As the cavalry thundered past them, Godric's retreating javelineers took heart, regrouped, and moved back up to the outskirts of the village. Faced with cavalry to their right and reinvigorated adversaries advancing to their front, Grimbold's light infantry retreated further into the village. But it did them little good. The cavalry jumped the walls of the village fields and charged into them. Many fell, pierced by javelins or cut down by swords, and the remainder scattered. Meanwhile, Godric and the king's spearmen had advanced along the road and into the village. Along the village street they marched. To their right, Godric's skirmishers pushed forward through the village fields, and to their left, Aldric's horses and men took a moment to catch their breath. Cutting down skirmishers is tiring work. But Grimbold was not beaten yet. He regathered his scattered light infantry and ordered them to counterattack Godric's right flank. As Godric's skirmishers advanced through the fields behind the village houses, Grimbold's men charged into them, and Godric's men were sent reeling back. While Godric's skirmishers fell back on his right flank, the king's spearmen continued to advance down the main street of the village. As they approached the end of the street, Grimbald's spearmen and Orm's spear dwarves appeared from their positions of concealment and formed a shield wall directly in front of them, blocking their way. The king's spearmen were outnumbered, and Godric hesitated. But he was only waiting for the cavalry. Aldric and his horsemen had recommenced their advance, and had now pushed right through the village. They appeared on the right flank of Orm and Grimbald's shield wall, and now it was Grimbald and Orm's turn to hesitate. The king's spearmen charged. Aldric's cavalry charged. Grimbald and Orm stood their ground. The fighting was unmerciful and relentless, and gaps began to open in both battle lines. Having driven off Godric's skirmishers, Grimbald's light infantry emerged onto the village street. At the end of the street, to their right, the battle raged, but between them and the clash of shield walls stood Godric. With a cry, Grimbald's light infantry charged toward Godric. Hearing their cry, Godric ran down the street and dodged around a corner. Seeing their king so threatened, Godric's skirmishers regrouped and came charging down the street in pursuit of Grimbald's light infantry. And Grimbald charged through a gap that had opened in the struggling ranks of spearmen before him, and fell upon Godric. Godric and Grimbald thus fought, sword to sword, fighting for honour and glory and victory. Swords shivered shields and struck sparks from mail shirts, but as yet neither had the advantage of the other. The battle had now become hopelessly confused, breaking down into a series of individual combats. But Godric had more troops, and this was beginning to tell. Looking over the battlefield, Orm observed the struggle between Godric and Grimbald, and realised that slaying Godric presented the best chance of still winning the day. He cut his way across to Grimbald and stood by his side, intending to join his axe to Grimbald's sword. But in vain. Godric's sword found an opening, striking Grimbald's leg below the hem of his mail. Grimbald staggered and lowered his shield, and as he did so, Godric thrust his sword into Grimbald's face and deep into his head. Grimbald fell dead. And now Godric's men rallied to his assistance, and Orm was overwhelmed by weight of numbers, and he too met his end, although he died a glorious death and took many of his opponents with him. But Godric exulted, as he knew that the battle and the war were won. Thus ended the Battle of Absley.